Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Hezekiah Butterworth, The Haunted House on Cambridge Common. It was in July 1843, in the evening before Washington Allston's funeral. I arrived in Boston late in the afternoon, and immediately started for Old Cambridge, where I expected to spend several days, attend the memorial service of the poet-artist, and witness his interment in the historic churchyard. The old house in Cambridge where I was to pass the night stood near the colleges, on the very ground where the Shepherd Memorial Church now stands. It was a very roomy mansion, with a quaint colonial expression and picturesqueness, and I approached it with a feeling of reverence or awe as I passed the colleges and came in sight of its cool, shady lawn. My friend Kenyon, whom I was to visit, had told me something about the place. It had belonged to a family by the name of Moore. Deacon Moore was a prominent man in colonial days and during the Revolutionary period, and was the treasurer of Dr. Holmes' church, as I shall soon have occasion more particularly to explain. I had heard Kenyon say that from the windows of the house a crowd of bright eyes had witnessed the cavalcade that conducted Washington to Cambridge. The old elm stands only a little distance from the place, under which the young general in 1775 took command of the army. Lombard poplars shaded the house in front, if I remember rightly, tall, spectral trees on which the moonlight was falling. There were two porticos, between which the visitor was expected to make a choice according to his social rank or station. At least it had been so in a former day, and the house suggested still a colonial rather than a republican code of etiquette. But I was not obliged to make a choice between them, as my friend was expecting me, and stood waiting for me in the deep, cool shadows before the open door. After supper we entered the roomy parlor where the windows were open and the lights turned low, and talked of our school days and old friends who were changed and gone. My feelings were somewhat mellowed by the subject. There was a stillness about the room, the house, and the colleges, which impressed me, and I suddenly recollected that I had heard Kenyon say, when we were school chums, that there was some strange mystery associated with the place. I reminded him of the remark, which began to awaken a deep curiosity in my mind, and asked, was the mysterious person supposed to be old Deacon Moore? He smiled faintly and said, "You are tired and nervous, and we shall pass all that now. These old stories have not been revived for years. Nearly every old house in Cambridge that outdates the present century has its legend, and this, I believe, is no exception to the rule of traditional ghost lore, but in that respect is rather a remarkable estate. But strange old Deacon Moore has ceased to walk nights, if ever he was more troublesome, and the mending of the outhouses, doors, and fences is now left wholly to carpenters. How the story of the deacon's ghostly wanderings used to unnerve me when I was a boy. I pity one," he continued, "who is subject to nervous fears. There is one room in this house that I used to dread, though I cannot tell why. My impressions, I have always noticed, have some association with reality. This impression, the dread, the fear, I used to experience on spending an hour in that room, seems to be causeless, and yet I have a feeling that more cause for it may yet be discovered. But it will hardly do to dwell upon this subject, for we are to spend the night in that very room. There is little danger that the old nervous horror will return upon me again, especially in your company. I used to suffer the most from it, if I remember rightly, when my mind was not fully occupied, and when I had been excited with much company and suddenly left alone. The place used to be my study and sleeping room, but I have not slept there now for many years. It has been fitted up for me again, while a part of the house is undergoing repairs." Kenyon rose to go into another room, asking to be excused, that he might speak to Mr. Jennison before the family retired. He was gone a long time, and when he returned, he proposed that we should go at once to our room, saying he knew I must be tired. The room was large, quaint, and old-fashioned, and there was something in the remarks that Kenyon had made that immediately interested me in it. It was a still, lovely night, and the moon, now risen in full splendor, covered the colleges and churches like a sea of haze, and barred with long lines of light the uncarpeted floor. I do not know but that the moonlight heightened the effect of Kenyon's suggestions of some mysteriousness about the apartment. Romance so frequently associates moonlight with what is mysterious, but However this may be, my feelings impelled me to ask further questions, although the subject had evidently become distasteful to my friend now that we were in the room. "Did you once think the room was haunted?" I ventured. "No, not exactly that," he said curtly. "Still, it used to seem to me that there were shapes and objects in it that could be felt rather than seen. Something wrong, something that ought not to be. There will be many artists and literary men in town tomorrow. We hardly appreciated Alston here. He led such a quiet, dignified, retired life." "Are there many old houses in Cambridge famous for legends or ghost lore?" I resumed. "Yes, there was the Vassal House, Longfellow's, and the Royal House at Medford, but this house, you said it held first rank in old colonial superstitions, I believe?" "Not in colonial times, but after that." "Was it reported to be haunted?" "Would you sleep more quietly if you knew?" "Yes, truth is better than suspense." "After Deacon Moore died, some peculations were found to have been committed." Well, the deacon was a very restless man before he died. He had a strange habit of wandering about the premises nights, with a hammer or hatchet in his hand, repairing outhouses and fences, and making the neighbors very unquiet at unreasonable hours. Well, after he died, it was discovered that he had been in the habit of appropriating money to his own use from the church treasury, and suspicion fell upon his character. Well, the sounds continued. What sounds? Oh, the hammering and the thumping, and the driving of nails in the night. But you surely do not believe that any such disturbances were caused by the disembodied spirit of Deacon Moore? No, I do not. I am not superstitious enough for that. The deacon was a very singular man, I am told, especially in his last days, and when suspicion fell upon his character after his decease, he was just such a person as superstitious minds would at that period expect to return in ghost form to haunt the place. And as his mending of building and fences nights was one of his most annoying characteristics, it is not strange that natural sounds occurring late at night should be attributed to his hammer. The event caused great excitement in its day, and nervous people for a long period avoided the place in the night. But, he continued, although I do not believe in any such silly stories as the old people used to tell, I do believe in my own impressions, and I have had a fixed impression for years that there was something wrong about the place. And when I am in my most sensitive moods, the mystery seems somehow to be associated with this very room. You may think me oversensitive and credulous, but I suffered from vague nervous impressions when I used to occupy the place. I have had an indistinct dread of it since I left it, and I would not sleep in it again tonight if you were not with me. I would not like to sleep in a room where I knew some great crime had been committed. Not that I would expect to be troubled by the victims, but because I am sensitive to the associations of the place. I would better rest in a room where a good man was married than one in which a bad man died. With many it would make no difference, but I cannot help this peculiar element implanted in my nature. The old Cambridge clock struck the hour of 12. We ceased talking. The wind rose, tossing the newly leaved branches of the trees, and causing dark shadows to move with an uncertain motion across the floor. With an unquiet feeling, I watched the shadows for a time, and then began to feel the sweet influences of sleep. The next night Washington Alston was buried in the old Cambridge churchyard. Brown, the landscape painter, must remember the scene. He was a pupil of Alston, and, if I remember rightly, was among the torchbearers when the remains were uncovered, and the moon breaking through the clouds shone full upon the face of the dead. After the funeral I returned to the house and inquired for Kenyon. I found a note from him saying he had been detained in Boston and would probably be compelled to remain there during the night. I am not superstitious, but the vision of my sleeping room and Kenyon's dread impression of it immediately rose before me, and I am free to confess that I did not enjoy the prospect of passing the night alone. I was lonesome without Kenyon, was tired, and I went to my room soon after returning, thinking I would lounge in a very inviting easy chair, and read until I became too drowsy to be at all influenced by the solitariness of the place or my constitutional nervous fears. I say constitutional nervous fears, for I, like Kenyon, was susceptible to more influences than I could see, hear, or define, and I, too, had observed that impressions received when I was highly sensitive almost always found some counterpart in reality, or met with some rather remarkable fulfillment. It was a partly cloudy night, with an atmosphere full of fragrance and a glorious moon. The few now living who attended Washington Allston's funeral must distinctly remember it. The parting clouds, the shadows anon shutting out the soft moonlight, the lights on the college grounds, the still, warm air. I leaned out of my window as the first relief from my solitary situation. Christ Church broke the view of the churchyard where the poet-artist had just been laid. I was wandering in dreams through the dim vistas of the past, catching, as it were, glimpses of forms long faded and gone, never to see the July sunshine or the green earth again, when a sudden sense of some mysterious influence began to steal over me. I can only describe it as a feeling that there was something that ought not to be in or about the room. I saw nothing, heard nothing, yet there seemed to be near the presence of something impalpable, a dark presence, an atmospheric chill and gloom. I am growing nervous, I thought, and I flung myself upon the bed. Did I dream? I cannot say. I seemed to be dreaming, and yet conscious of my dreams, to have a double consciousness, a double sense of things. The dark, impalpable presence seemed to descend, and then began a dream or semi-consciousness of the supposed circumstances that were extraordinary. It seemed as if a mason was building a vault under the floor. I fancied I could hear the rattle of bricks, the splash of mortar, and the click of a trowel. I started up. The dream passed away. It was a bright night, and the wind breathed refreshingly through the trees. I was vexed at my own nervousness, and presently was half asleep again. But in that debatable condition, between sleeping and waking, the same sounds seemed to be repeated, the fall of bricks, the splash of mortar, the click of the trowel. I tried to think of Kenyon in old school days. The click of the trowel became fainter. I heard the clock striking 12 and fell asleep. Towards morning I was roused by a passing wagon in the street. It could have been but a moment between sleeping and waking, but in that moment the same vivid dream was repeated. I fancied I could hear the sound of masonry under the floor. Fully awake, I heard nothing, and my sleep had been sweet and undisturbed. Towards morning I found myself drowsy again, when the click of the trowel again startled me. I started up, threw myself into the armchair, and sat there undisturbed until morning began to redden in the east. Kenyon returned before noon, when I went with him to Boston, and took leave of him there. I never forgot the impressions of that night, though I did not tell Kenyon of them. I seldom recall dreams, and I cannot relate any dream I have ever had in my life except that one, so vividly repeated. As I have thought of that, I have had a horror of nervous disease, for it fixed in my mind the conviction that no suffering could be more dreadful than nervous apprehension and fear. Many years passed before I saw Cambridge again. I have not the exact date now, but it was the year when the building of the Shepherd Memorial Church began. The old Charles River Bridge had given place to a more substantial structure, as I noticed when I passed. Kenyon was in Nevada, and the old Moore house was uninhabited and was soon to be taken down. The land on which it stood was to be used by the Society of the Shepherd Memorial Church for their new building. I was at my hotel one evening when a newsboy entered the hall and said, "Journal, Traveler, Herald, startling discovery. 2 bodies found in a vault under the old Moore house." I started to my feet. I bought a copy of each of the papers, the Herald giving the most detailed and curious account. The paper described the situation of the room, and I felt a nervous perspiration steal over me, as I identified it as the very apartment that Kenyon had occupied, and about which he had given me such an unfavorable impression, and in which we had passed the night together, and I had dreamed the one vivid dream that stamped itself indelibly upon my memory. I immediately went to the place. The house was partly taken down, and a great crowd of people were around it, and within the admissible part of the ruins. I went to my old chamber, forcing my way with an air of special concern through the crowd. The floor was taken up. Under it was an open brick vault. It was empty. Men and boys were talking about the bodies. I received the most unsatisfactory answers to my questions about the discovery and turned to the policeman who had taken charge of the place. "Where are the bodies?" I asked. "The old skeletons? They have been removed. What is your opinion about them? Violence?" "Well, the bones are so old you can't tell. They may be, for aught anyone knows, 100 years old. This is a very old house, and they used to tell some curious stories about it a very long time ago. People got the idea it was haunted. People used to believe in such things more than they do now." "Did any two persons ever disappear mysteriously from Cambridge society?" "Not that I have heard of. But how could such a vault as this have been built without exciting suspicion?" "I don't know." He presently added, "Anatomies, perhaps." "But why were the skeletons hidden in such a room as this under the floor? Why were they placed in a vault at all?" "I don't know. It all looks kind of mysterious." And with an easy air that showed that mysterious things were not unfamiliar to him, he walked slowly away. The vault was nearly under the place where my bed had been on the nights I had occupied the room, and where probably Kenyon's bed had stood when the room was his study. Old people associated the discovery with Deacon Moore. The stories about his strange habits, and his supposed peculations from Dr. Holmes' church treasury, and about the mysterious noises on the premises after his decease, were again revived, and old New England superstition for a few days seemed to start into new life in the town. A case of circumstantial evidence, throwing suspicion upon the eccentric deacon, was at once made up, but it seemed to have as little basis in fact, and the same suspicion would doubtless have fallen upon any other singular person who might have long ago occupied the house. The leading facts of this story are true, and will readily be recognized, and I would not for the sake of heightening the effect of a plot do injustice to the memory of one who may have been a wholly innocent man. I can but remember in associating tales and rumors with facts, that old New England superstition threw a shade of suspicion over many an innocent name. It is a Cambridge mystery, and it gathers around it the gloom and romance of nearly 100 years. Who were these people? Were they brought to their hidden tomb by the hand of violence? If so, why were they placed in a vault in a private house, where time would surely disclose the secret of their burial and raise the darkest suspicions? Were they anatomical specimens? Then why were they hidden at all? The old Moore house is gone. The historic church of Dr. Holmes is gone, and the finest of Cambridge's churches now raises its finger-like spire over the spot where the mansion of the mysterious deacon once stood. I sometimes pass the place in my evening walks, and the old tradition, and more recent mysterious discovery, return to my mind vividly. But it is all an association of the past, of times dark and ended, faded and gone, and the mystery that now is, it ever will remain. The end.